I have systematically dismantled the fallacies of postmodernism, leaving no room for its return. Alan Sokal destroys postmodernism forever.
Have you ever wondered what would happen if a respected academic journal published an article that was, well, complete and utter gibberish? Well, that's exactly what happened. This is the story of a prank that shook the academic world to its core and kicked off a huge debate about the nature of truth itself.
It all kind of starts with statements like this one. This is from the super influential French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. He's claiming that the structure of a neurotic person is, and I'm quoting here, exactly the torus, which is a mathematical shape that's basically a donut. So what do you do with that? Is that a deep, profound insight into the human mind, or is it just fancy-sounding jargon that doesn't really mean anything at all? And that is the exact question that physicist Alan Sokal decided to answer with a really, really bold experiment.
So how did this all kick off? Well, it all started with a single, incredibly mischievous article that was basically designed from the ground up to be a trap.
Okay, so you've got Alan Sokal. He's a physicist. He works with hard evidence, with theories you can actually test. And he started getting really concerned about this intellectual trend called postmodernism. The way he saw it, this trend was treating science like it was just a social construct. The idea that scientific facts aren't objective truths, but are just stories that a certain culture tells itself, no more real than any other myth.
So here's the play-by-play of how the prank went down. In late '94, Sokal sits down and writes a complete parody article. He just crams it full of nonsense that sounds really academic and impressive. Then, he sends it off to a big-deal cultural studies journal, Social Text. And in the spring of '96, they publish it, in a special issue called Science Wars, no less. You can't make this stuff up. Then, literally that same day, Sokal drops another article in a different magazine, revealing the whole thing was a hoax.
His parody was just filled with real quotes from famous intellectuals, but he applied them in ways that were completely absurd. For instance, he'd take a real concept from quantum physics and then connect it to something in literary theory where it made absolutely zero sense. And the whole point was to see if a journal would publish something that flattered their own ideological biases, even if it was fundamentally meaningless.
And they did. They published it. The trap was sprung, and the fallout was, let's just say, immediate and pretty explosive.
And this wasn't just some little argument in an obscure academic corner. Oh no, this thing went global. We're talking front-page news in major papers all over the world. It sparked this huge public conversation about what was going on inside our universities.
Now, while some academics were, as you can imagine, furious, Sokal also got tons of support. A lot of students and professors felt like he had finally said what they were all thinking, that he'd exposed a really serious problem of intellectual laziness in their fields. It was the classic Emperor's New Clothes story come to life.
But the hoax itself was just the opening act. It was really the spark for a much, much bigger critique. Sokal actually teamed up with another physicist, Jean Briment, and they wrote a whole book called Fashionable Nonsense, where they really laid out their entire case.
In the book, they argued that the hoax pointed to a larger pattern of what they called intellectual abuse. This included things like, just throwing around scientific terms to sound smart, dragging scientific ideas into the humanities where they just don't belong, and basically just stringing together big words to confuse and intimidate people who aren't scientists.
And they came with receipts. Their book is packed with specific chapter and verse examples of what they saw as total nonsense. Let's take a look at a couple.
So for example, they highlight this passage from the philosopher Luce Irigaray. She's asking if Einstein's famous equation is sexed because it gives a special place, a privilege, to the speed of light.
And the response from Sokal and Briment is pretty straightforward. Look, this isn't a matter of opinion or privilege. E equals mc squared describes a physical reality. We've tested it. It's confirmed. If you swap out c, the speed of light, with any other speed, the equation is just wrong. It doesn't work. End of story.
All right, here's another one they pulled out. This is from the literary critic Julia Kristeva. She's making a connection between poetry and something called the cardinality of the continuum. Now, that is a super specific, very abstract concept from a part of math called set theory.
And again, Sokal and Brickmont's point is pretty simple. There is just no logical reason to connect this particular mathematical idea to linguistics. They say it's not being used to actually explain anything about poetry. It's being used to sound profound and maybe intimidate readers who don't have a PhD in mathematics.
And the book is just packed with stuff like this. You can see they look at claims that modern war happens in a non-Euclidean space, or they point out basic mix-ups between things like velocity and acceleration. For Sokal and Brickmont, this wasn't just a few random errors. It was a consistent pattern of people posturing instead of making clear arguments.
So you can see how this one prank just completely blew the lid off a much bigger, more fundamental fight over ideas, which people started calling the science wars.
At its core, this whole thing was a clash between two totally different ways of looking at the world. On one side, you have scientific rationality, the belief that there's an objective reality out there that we can learn about with evidence and logic. And on the other side, you have what's called cognitive relativism, the idea that truth itself is relative, that science is just one story among many, and it doesn't have any special claim to being the truth.
Now, one of the main tools that the rationalist side uses to draw a line in the sand is this idea of falsifiability. It's a simple but powerful concept. For a theory to count as scientific, there has to be some way you could, in principle, prove it false. If a theory can explain literally anything and can never be proven wrong, think of astrology, then it's not really explaining anything useful. It's not science.
Okay, I get it. This might all sound like some fascinating but abstract academic fight. But why should this matter to the rest of us? What are the actual real-world stakes here?
Well, here's where it gets really serious. The authors argue that if you give up on the whole idea of objective truth, you actually lose the ability to challenge things that are just plain wrong. I mean, if all stories are equally valid, how can you argue against climate change denial or say for certain that some historical events absolutely did happen?
And that's why this isn't just about defending science. The ultimate point Sokal and Brickmont were making is that clear thinking and a basic respect for evidence are vital for a healthy society. They believed that throwing out the ideal of objective truth isn't liberating, it's actually dangerous. It makes all of us more vulnerable to propaganda and misinformation, and it makes it way harder to solve the real problems facing us.
The Sokal affair happened way back in the 90s, but the core question it raises, well, it feels more urgent today than it ever has. We live in a world that is flooded with alternative facts and disinformation. So how do we, in our own lives, tell the difference between a genuinely complex idea and something that's just designed to confuse us and muddy the waters? That's the challenge Sokal's hoax still leaves us with.